This is the blind landing experimental unit of the United Kingdom's Ministry of Technology, with whose cooperation this film was made. The unit is located at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Bedford, England. Here, flight investigations of pilot displays, runway lighting and markings has permitted fog landings in visibilities down to ICAO Category 3B conditions. The purpose of this film is to show the changes in runway lighting and marking that a pilot sees during an approach and landing in daytime fog. 9 approaches show the different visual conditions that may occur in the life of a fog. All the runs are in a varsity aircraft of the BLEU fleet, and the camera is mounted between the 2 pilots with a downward cutoff of 13 degrees. Approach speed is 110 knots. Most of the approaches are completely automatic, including kickoff, drift, and touchdown, followed by a short manual rollout and takeoff. But in some of them, the pilot takes over at a low altitude and performs a manual touchdown. Before we see the fog sequences, let us look at an approach to the runway at Bedford Aerodrome in clear conditions to see the visual aids that are used in the fog runs. In the lighting, there is a standard Calvert approach pattern modified in the last 1,000 feet to have both a widened center line similar to that of the ALPA pattern and red barrettes previously seen as recommended by the ICAO All-Weather Operations Panel for Category 2 operations. The runway width is 300 feet with center line and edge lighting at 100-foot intervals. Threshold markings, width, and gauge line spacing is 150 feet. The painted markings on the runway have been developed at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, RAE, Bedford, and in daylight fog, they are often the pilot's chief external source of information. The runway distance to go numeral can be read in very low visibility. This diagram shows the geometry governing the segment of lights which pilots can see. The farthest point is fixed by the slant visual range of the lights and the nearest by the cockpit cutoff. Before each approach, a fog structure diagram showing how the pilot's visual segment varies with height will be shown. This is the diagram for approach number 1. The wheel height is plotted on the vertical axis, and the amount of lighting the pilot can see is plotted along the horizontal axis. The red line is the 500-foot segment and is regarded as a limit for any kind of manual landing. The diagram shows that the pilot will have a large visual segment early in his approach, but that as he descends, the area of visual reference will reduce to a minimum of about 1,200 feet in the 130 to 160 foot height band and then increase. This condition could be caused by either a dense layer of fog with its top in the height band 130 to 160 feet or by a dense patch of fog drifting across the approach area as the aircraft passes through this height band. In this approach, both conditions occur. Patches of fog are drifting over the runway, and they contain dense layers. The reductions in segment caused by the fog during this run are not too serious, but as you see, slightly denser patches of fog could result in the pilot losing all contact with the ground. The visibility from 50 feet and the runway visual range, RVR, are good, and touchdown and rollout present no difficulties. In this diagram, the continuous line shows the visual segment trend, and indicates a slight improvement in visual segment as the aircraft descends. The dotted line, however, shows the actual behavior of the visual segment. The amount of lighting to be seen changes in an erratic and confusing fashion as layers and patches of fog drift across the runway. Guidance is never completely lost, but the visual segment of the approach lighting does reduce to less than 500 feet between heights of 200 feet and 130 feet. At this stage of the approach, we can see patches of fog and the first lights of the approach pattern. As we descend toward the fog top, the amount of visible approach lighting increases, and then on entering the fog top, it decreases, as it was shown in the diagram. The autopilot makes a slight correction to the aircraft's path at this point, and the difficulty of assessing this maneuver by reference to the ground is clearly shown. The visual segment from 100 feet downward and the runway visual range are quite good, but the conditions above 100 feet would have made it difficult for the pilot to assess his position using external cues. The conditions on this approach are similar to those for the last approach, in that the fog is still patchy. However, on this approach, the trend line shows a maximum segment at the 200-foot altitude, which decreases quite rapidly to a minimum segment of less than 500 feet at 100 feet altitude, and remains at this value to touchdown. This is obviously a dangerous situation, since the transition to this condition may occur very suddenly, and a pilot may experience a sudden deterioration of the visual segment after he is committed to a landing. The red barrettes were switched off for this approach. Segments of the lighting can be seen through holes in the fog, but these holes are getting smaller as the fog thickens. The area of the visual segment below 100 feet is too short for the pilot to flare and land his aircraft, but the painted markings do provide him with some information. The fog has continued to thicken and is approaching its mature state. Now there is just one hole left in the fog, and a brief glimpse of the approach lighting is seen as the aircraft descends through the 190-foot to 100-foot height band. The lighting is then obscured, and the next sight of the ground is provided by the runway markings. The aircraft is above the fog, which has a top at about 200 feet. As we pass through 200-foot level, we begin to see some approach lighting through a small hole in the fog, and the aircraft descends into the hole. The fog is entered at 120 feet, and all contact with the ground is lost until the runway markings are seen. The fog has now reached its mature state. Some slight further thickening may occur, but the sudden erratic changes in the visual segment area often associated with periods of fog formation or clearing are no longer present. In daylight, the threshold markings often provide the first real indication of the ground, although one or two approach lights may be seen immediately before them. The holes in the fog have disappeared, and we enter the fog at 200 feet without seeing the ground. We shall get our first glimpse of the runway in a moment, But as you see, the pilot is unable to see enough of the ground to assess his aircraft's position and has insufficient information to initiate a maneuver before touchdown. After touchdown, the pilot will need some instrument aid to help him control his aircraft. But the painted lines and runway distance to go markers do provide some guidance. This diagram shows that the ground will not be seen until the aircraft descends to below 50 feet and that the runway visual range is 200 feet. Under these conditions, the pilot will require instrument guidance to help him complete his landing after touchdown, although taxiing by outside reference is still possible. The top of the fog can be clearly seen from this height. The actual point of entry into the fog is characterized by a sudden decrease in brightness. The threshold markings will be seen in a moment. Notice how they and the centerline strips define the ground plane for the pilot and avoid the sensation of sinking into a hole. Even in these very low visual ranges, it is still possible to see the runway distance to go markers. The diagram for this approach is practically the same as for the previous approach. The runway visual range is still about 200 feet, and the pilot will need instrument guidance to complete his landing after touchdown. You can see that the fog has become considerably deeper since the last approach without any change in visual sequence. It is quite common for this to happen, and a fog may gradually deepen over several hours without the visual sequence changing. We shall have our first view of the ground after the aircraft has descended below 50 feet. The ground roll is short, but some variation in visual range can be seen along the runway. Such variations are normal in fog and may be both large and sudden during periods of formation or clearance. The contrast between this diagram and the last indicates that the fog is clearing. Clearances are often very rapid and may occur in a number of ways. The three chief conditions associated with clearing fog are: the fog may lift into a cloud base with fairly clear visibility under it. It may blow away or freeze out, or it may decay into a shallow layer of fog on or just above the ground, as this fog is doing. The presence of a shallow fog is always dangerous, since the pilot will normally be able to see a large segment of the ground from above it, but will encounter a severe reduction of visual segment on entering it. On this approach, the segment is more than 2,000 feet at the 300-foot altitude and reduces to 1,000 feet at 200 feet. It is only 200 feet at a height of 100 feet, and the runway visual range is 250 feet. If the fog is a shallow layer above the ground, visual sequences of this sort might be associated with quite large runway visual ranges. The ground is visible while the aircraft is still above 500 feet, and the approach lighting is first seen through what appears to be haze at about 450 feet. At 280 feet, practically all the approach lighting can be seen, but the segment now begins to reduce, and the far point of lighting no longer appears to recede as the aircraft descends. At 150 feet, it is not possible to see all of the last 1,000 feet of approach lighting, and at 100 feet, the threshold still cannot be seen. At an altitude of 80 feet, the threshold markings can be seen, and the aircraft carries on to a touchdown in a runway visual range of about 250 feet. Once again, the runway visual range varies along the runway. The shallow fog persists for this approach. The runway visual range has increased to 300 feet, and although the visual segment still decreases with height, it does not do so as rapidly as in the last approach, or reach a minimum value before touchdown. Once again, conditions appear hazy, and the ground can be seen very early in the approach. This approach was flown manually to give some idea of the difficulties of maneuvering under these conditions. At an altitude of 320 feet, the approach lighting can be seen, and at 250 feet, most of it is visible. At a 170-foot altitude, the aircraft starts a quick alignment maneuver to bring it over the center line. The angles of bank are about 10 degrees, and the maneuver is complete at 80 feet. At this altitude, the visual segment has decreased to 1,000 feet. The segment now continues to reduce until the aircraft touches down in a runway visual range of about 300 feet. The pilot of this aircraft has in common with most instrument-rated pilots a vital interest in the flight operations problems associated with all-weather landings. The VC-10 aircraft is one of many which has been designed to make use of automatic landing equipment developed as a result of research at the Blind Landing Experimental Unit. More than 20 years of research and trial of automatic landing systems conducted in various member states of the International Civil Aviation Organization is being studied as a result of the ICAO All-Weather Operations Panel meetings. Those in ICAO who have viewed the fog runs made at BLEU think they show quite clearly the changing visual conditions which present special difficulties to pilots landing in fog. Shallow fogs are difficult for pilots to detect. Sometimes the far point of the visual field seems to be stationary and then appears to move toward the aircraft. This effect is similar to the effect introduced by a nose-up pitching moment with a reduced visual segment, and may thus lead pilots to make an unnecessary and possibly dangerous pitch-down correction. This approach, however, presented no such problem, and a safe landing was assured.